Smart woman. Smart woman. Always good to have your back up.
You can, yeah. There you go. I'm going to go this way.
It's the hardest part for me.
Good morning, everyone. If those of you in the back want to come sit down, we'll get started. So it is my great delight this morning to introduce our speaker, Union alum and distinguished scholar Kelly Brown Douglas, who is the Elizabeth Conley Todd Distinguished Professor of Religion at Goucher College and the director of Goucher's Religion Program. This year's Union Day's theme, and Union Days is our alumni event, so I want to pause here and say a special word of welcome to the class of 65, 50 years, the class of 90, 25 years, and the class of 2005, 10 years. So welcome to you all. The theme of this year's Union Days is Why We Still Can't Wait. Earth Matters, Race Matters. And on this topic, there is no theological voice weighing in with more vigor and insight than the voice of Kelly Brown Douglas. Among a long list of highly regarded and, I must say, often taught, I have been teaching Kelly Brown Douglas's books in my systematics course for decades. She writes books that students can read and learn from in courses. We discussed her book this morning in my class. But among this long list of publications, her most recent book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, weighs in with clarion clarity. We are a nation still held in the grips of a white supremacy with long, deep roots in Western culture, forged in the brutal 200-year legacy of chattel slavery, and strengthened and deepened, indeed fortified, under Jim Crow, and now in the new Jim Crow of our present, it takes the form of aggressive and deepening, brutal criminalization of the Black body to secure white identity. White supremacy imprisons and destroys the bodies of Black and brown Americans. Yesterday's account, the first of her 2 lectures, was analytically precise and frighteningly accurate. Our nation is in a crisis, and the question is, do we have the political will to enact the change that is needed, both at an individual level and at a structural level, to dismantle the privileges of white supremacy? There's a long history of these conversations and actions taking place at Union, most recently in our student involvement in Black Lives Matters, both in New York City, and at Union and in Ferguson. And the question that's often asked in the midst of these conversations, as it is asked in the wake of yesterday's presentation, is the question, so where is the hope? There's no more important question in our present day. No more important question. In fact, it's been in the headline of leading progressive journals in this country, marked most vividly by Ta-Nehisi Coates' conversation with our own Cornel West about the status of hope in the context of analysis of the status of racism in the U.S. today. And most recently into that conversation has walked the clarion voice of Michelle Alexander, who, along with Cornel West, says to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who comes out of a context with no religious mooring, that we as a nation do not have the luxury of giving up hope. There's too much at stake. This morning, Dr. Douglas will wade into this urgent conversational territory as she talks with us about hope and life and the severity of the situation in which we find ourselves. She is a friend of Union. She is a friend of mine. She is a friend of all those who suffer. And she is a friend of those who seek the justice of God. Welcome, Dr. Douglas.
Wow, again, it is just so very humbling to be here with you and to be here at Union and to be with friends who are family. As I see some of my colleagues of Renee and Mary, and always my good and dear friend Marvin, and my good and dear friend Serene. And so thank you for those very generous words, Serene. And I thank you all even more for the generosity of your friendships. Today, I hope to lead us into a conversation on the justice of God and perhaps that hope to which Serene spoke. We need justice for our son, declared Michael Brown's parents after he was gunned down in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. Ironically, 2 days before Michael's death, on August 7th, 2014, a jury found the killer of Renisha McBride guilty of second-degree murder, along with other gun-related charges. You might recall that Renisha was the young black female in Michigan who, after knocking on a door for help following a single-car accident, was shot in the face when the homeowner answered the door with shotgun in hand. On October 1st, 2014, during a retrial, Michael Dunn was found guilty of Jordan Davis's murder. Jordan was the young black male gunned down in a Jacksonville, Florida gas station after a dispute over loud music. Jordan's mother said that this verdict of his killer represented, she said, justice for Trayvon and for all the nameless faces and children and people that will never have justice and will never rather have a voice. The convictions of Renisha's and Jordan's killers, while certainly a just end in these cases, gives not the full justice for which Michael's mother or the other mothers of murdered black children demand. This is not the justice for which these mothers weep. Theirs is a justice that goes beyond the conviction of their children's killers. The justice for which they wait and weep is divine justice, the very justice of God. And so it is that this morning I ask, what is the meaning of God's justice in this stand your ground time in which we find ourselves living? Now, in answering this question, we must first understand something about the nature of stand your ground culture in relationship to God. And that is this: we must recognize that stand your ground culture is nothing less than a culture of sin. Sin is that which alienates human beings from the ways and will of God. It reflects a breach with God and what God stands for. Stand your ground culture reflects such a breach, as it functions both on an individual and systemic level. As Gustavo Gutierrez says, all injustice is a breach with God. As for its individual manifestation, this is a culture that thrives on its antagonistic relationships, as signaled by the very ideal of standing one's ground. In this regard, stand your ground culture does not value the sacred humanity and life of another. Indeed, as a sinful construct, stand your ground culture is sustained by a notion of not belonging. Certain human beings are assumed to not belong in certain spaces and to not belong to God. Moreover, stand your ground culture disengages persons not only from their humanity, but most significantly from their very lives. Indeed, the person on the other side of the stand your ground gun is not seen as a human being, much less as a sacred child of God with a life that is to be honored. One only needs to be reminded that the stand your ground law was initially called shoot first, suggesting that whoever was on the other side of the gun had no real worth. Behind the myth of self-protection, which stand your ground law hides behind, is a disdain for certain bodies, most notably the bodies of black and brown people. In effect, stand your ground culture empowers people to deny the sacredness of God's human creation. It is therefore a culture of death. As this culture is antithetical to life, it is a negation of all that God stands for. Stand your ground culture stands in opposition to a God who creates life and who resurrected Jesus from the dead. Inasmuch as individuals engage in the denigration and destruction of life in any way, and thus inasmuch as they participate in stand your ground culture, those individuals have sinned. Stand your ground culture also nurtures systemic and structural sin. Laws such as stand your ground stop and frisk, conceal and carry speak for themselves. They objectify and devalue life. They are meant to oppress and humiliate. Other aspects of stand your ground culture, such as the industrial prison complex, are structures and systems of sin as they thrive on denying life and freedom to others. There is simply no getting around it. Stand your ground culture in all of its manifestations is a sinful culture. Theologian Sally McFague is right when she says, the dignity of human beings and the integrity of creation rest, first of all, on our willingness to affirm the value of life, not just our own or our own tribe or our own religion or country or class or species. As she further suggests, we need to be able to look at one another and see the good that is God. Since stand your ground culture does not allow people to see the goodness of God in the faces of those who are not white, it is a culture of sin. It is, in fact, the sin that sin produced. In our discussion, if our discussion yesterday revealed anything, it revealed that the stand your ground culture, which took the lives of Trayvon, Jordan, Renisha, Jonathan, Rakia, Tamir, Michael, Freddie, and unfortunately, I can go on and on. This culture is not a 21st century phenomenon. Rather, it is, as I said yesterday, part and parcel of America's narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, a narrative that designates the free space as a white space and thus meets black intrusion into that space with hostility and more often than not with the penalty of death. This narrative, therefore, is nothing other than America's original sin. The doctrine of original sin is not meant to suggest the origins of sin itself. Rather, it signals the fact that the human condition is one defined by a captivity to sin. To recognize America's narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism as the nation's original sin is to realize that the unspoken but palpable identity of the nation itself is a sinful identity. Essentially, the way in which the early Americans, that is, the Pilgrims and Puritans, as well as the Founding Fathers, constructed the identity of the nation is consequential. It has virtually meant that the nation has been held captive to sin. There have been those who have considered the inhumane treatment of the Native Americans as America's original sin. Others have claimed it to be the enslavement of African Americans. Both are sins, but they are the sins that sin produced. They are reflections of stand your ground culture, which itself is a production of America's grand narrative of exceptionalism. In his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln lamented that American slavery was an offense to God. It was, in his estimation, a sin. He conjectured that the Civil War, which had torn the nation apart, was a result of this sin. He feared, as he said, the judgments of the Lord if the sin of slavery were not removed. Lincoln was right in naming slavery as a sin. What he did not understand was the original sin that produced slavery, the very exceptionalism upon which the nation was built. And as was also pointed out yesterday, some 150 years later, our nation is still a nation divided by war. It is divided by a stand your ground culture war. It cannot be said enough that such a war will reinvent itself throughout history until the original sin of America's Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism is forthrightly addressed and eliminated. The salvation of our nation depends upon it. And this brings us to the justice of God. For the manifestation of salvation from the sin of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism signals nothing less than the reality of God's justice. As Daniel Day Williams said, God's justice is manifest in God working to put down the unrighteous, expose idols, show mercy, and achieve reconciliation in a new order which expresses human dignity as the bearer of the divine image. In other words, God's justice means a restoration of the sacred dignity of all people. It means healing the breach of sin that is injustice, which is nothing other than the freedom from sin. That is, freedom from the sin of injustice itself. And so first and foremost, God's justice means freedom. Freedom not in some other world, but in the world in which the sin of injustice functions. Put simply, if sin is not simply an otherworldly construct, but rather is that which impacts the quality and condition of one's historical life, then the salvation which is God's justice must not simply refer to an otherworldly or spiritual state. The freedom from sin that is God's justice must be an earthly freedom. Moreover, the meaning of that freedom must be understood from the vantage point of the victims of injustice, the victims of stand-your-ground culture. Why? Because it matters. It matters that Jesus died on the cross, just as it matters that God freed the Israelites from bondage. For through both of these divine revelations, God revealed a preferential option for freedom that was defined by God's solidarity with the oppressed, the enslaved, the crucified classes of people in the world. Now let me stay with this for just a moment. That Jesus was crucified affirms his absolute identity with the Trayvons, the Jordans, the Renishas, and all other victims of the stand-your-ground culture war. Jesus' identification with the lynched crucified class is not accidental, it is intentional. It did not begin with his death on the cross. In fact, that Jesus was crucified signals his prior bond with the crucified class of his day. There is perhaps no story that reveals this more than the story of Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman at the well. In the social religious context of Jesus' day, there was a long history of conflict between Jews and Samaritans. Jews had constructed images of Samaritans as an indecent and ritually impure people. Samaritan women were considered the most impure of all. Multiple narratives of power intersected on the bodies of Samaritan women: ethnic, gender, and cultural. Put simply, they represented at once an inferior race, gender, and religion. Samaritan women were indeed the least of these in Jesus' day. Moreover, the relationship between Jewish men and Samaritan women was one of extreme opposition. This relationship reflects in the first century Roman world the antagonistic opposition between white bodies and black bodies in our context of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Yet, as the story unfolds, Jesus initiates a salvific relationship with this woman. The body that is constructed is the one most opposed to his, and most significantly, the body that represents the most scorned and marginalized of his day. He initiates a salvific relationship with. In making such an alliance, Jesus repudiates the narratives and constructs of power, empties himself of the power and privileges that might come with being a Jewish male, and effectively becomes one with the crucified class of people, to which I will return later. His crucifixion is therefore inevitable. Theologians have referred to Jesus' self-emptying as kenosis, which, as you know, indicates his sacrificial obedience to God. However, when understood in the context of Jesus' full ministry as it led to his crucifixion, this kenosis, this self-emptying, indicates his letting go of anything that would compromise his absolute alliance with those of the crucified class. John Soprino puts it this way: the cross, for its part, tells of God's affinity with victims. The point of the matter is that it is only when the least of these, in this instance those victims of stand-your-ground culture, are free to achieve the fullness of life that is theirs, that God's justice will be realized. Their freedom will indicate an eradication of all that separates people one from another, and thus disengages all people from the goodness of their humanity. It is only when the lives of the least of these are honored, respected, and esteemed in the world systemically, structurally, and individually that we will come to know the justice that is God's. Their freedom will signal a freedom from sin. It happened one night on an isolated road. As they were headed back to college, my son and two of his black male friends were stopped by white police officers. By all accounts, even that of my son's white lawyer, they were stopped for the crime of driving while black. From putting them up against the car, frisking them, and searching their car numerous times, the officers did all they could to let my son and his friends know that being college students did not exempt them from being criminals. As if to ensure that they recognized this, my son and his friends were made to appear in court. At the end of the day, no crime was committed, so the case was eventually resolved. This incident reminded me of how close my worst nightmare was to becoming reality. The wrong word spoken, the wrong move made, and my son could have become a stand-your-ground culture casualty. And without parents who were aware of the criminal justice system and who had the economic means to hire a lawyer, my son would have become another black male trapped in the stand-your-ground culture of criminality. And so, as my son was free to leave the courtroom, I thought of those sons of black mothers that are not free to leave, but become trapped in the cycle of criminality simply because they are black and poor. It is from their vantage point that we are to understand the meaning of the justice of God. And so, what does that look like? What does God's justice look like from the sin of in the midst of the sin of stand-your-ground culture, especially from the vantage point of those who are most victimized by it, the least of these? Now, before I look at that more closely, let me make just another little excursion to point out that there has been no faith tradition which has witnessed more to the meaning of God's justice and thus freedom from the vantage point of the least of these than the black faith tradition. Informed by a rich African religious heritage, then forged in the crucible of slavery, black faith is grounded in two core beliefs. First, that God is by nature free, therefore complete in God's self and dependent on no other being or power for existence. And second, that God's movement in history reflects God's very freedom. To proclaim God free by nature is in fact to attest to God's transcendence. The transcendence of God indicates that God is not bound by the world. The freedom that is God is the transcendence of God. A transcendent God is one who is free from being boxed in by any human projections. God is free, free from all finite, limiting, human-constructed realities. The transcendence that is the freedom of God is what black church people testify to when they say, God can be God, all by God's self. Now, to affirm the freedom of God is essential for a black faith born on the soil of their oppressor's faith, a faith that claimed that God intended for black people to be slaves, that is, relegated to an unfree space. For inasmuch as black faith affirmed that black people, like all humans, are created in the image of a God that was free, then the black faithful knew that they were meant to be free. That is, like God, free from all human constructs and constraints that prevents the full flourishing of life. Simply put, because black faith affirms that humans are created in the image of God and not the other way around, it can also affirm that black bodies are to be freed from the ravages of stand-your-ground culture, which leads us to the second fundamental affirmation of black faith when it comes to the freedom of God. To reiterate, black faith affirms that this is a freedom that is manifest in history. In short, black faith affirms, as many of you well know, that just as God freed the Israelites from slavery and Jesus from the crucifying death of the cross, God would likewise free black people from the enslaving and crucifying realities of their living. Black faith, therefore, provides black women and men with the tools to resist the Anglo-Saxonist discursive productions that attempt to crush their very spirit and destroy their very lives. Indeed, the black faith itself is nothing less than a discourse of resistance that allows black people to affirm their innate and created worth, even when all around them suggests their utter worthlessness. This faith testifies to another way of seeing oneself that is not determined by the ideologies of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, such as white supremacy. Black faith testifies to a God that allows black people to maintain their sense of divine dignity and claim their strength in the face of a stand-your-ground culture that seeks to pervert their self-images and disrespect their bodies. This faith enables black people to see themselves from beyond the veil of Anglo-Saxon whiteness. In the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, it frees black men and women from the sense, as he says, of always looking at oneself through the eyes of white others. This faith, therefore, helps black women and men to develop an independent consciousness and thus to claim their God-given inalienable right to be free, free from the web of sin produced by the sin of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. To reiterate, such freedom reflects the justice of God, as again, God's justice means freedom from sin. One of the clearest witnesses to the meaning of freedom when it comes to the justice of God and its significance for the black faithful was on display this summer at the time of the massacre of 9 black church people at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. To the surprise, if not consternation of some, various family members of those parishioners slain by Dylann Roof proclaimed that they forgave him. While the meaning of forgiveness is complex within the black faith tradition, such forgiveness is not about the exoneration of the killer for the deadly injustice he allegedly perpetrated. Rather, it is about the justice of God and the freedom of the families from the killer's sinful act. An act, by the way, fueled by the ideology of white supremacy, which is a sin which Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism produced. The forgiveness demonstrated by the families of the slain in the first instance recognizes that no human justice can adequately respond to the grave injustice of such a racist, terroristic, murderous crime. Forgiveness, then, is a sign of the family's faith that God's justice will ultimately prevail, and thus their forgiveness is freeing, for it frees them from the anguish of knowing that no human justice will make up for the loss of their family members. Secondly, forgiveness frees the families from being trapped in the sinful cycle of the killer's hate. Forgiveness is not a palliative for rightful anger and rage. Instead, it frees the families from the kind of hate that not only distorts their sense of self, but also prevents them from moving forward in their own living. But more importantly, forgiveness recognizes that the loving justice of God is more powerful than the sin of white racist hate. In the end, forgiveness within the black faith tradition, inasmuch as it is grounded in the belief in the justice of God, frees black people to continue to persevere in the struggle to be free from the sinful productions of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. And so with this, let us return to the question of what precisely the justice of God, what looks like, that is freedom from sin looks like in these stand-your-ground times. And most importantly, what are the implications of that justice for us? In response to the 1960s racial unrest, James Baldwin declared, "The time has come for us to examine ourselves, but we can do this only if we are willing to free ourselves from the myths of America and to find out what is really happening here. To be sure, we continue to be trapped in the sin of stand-your-ground culture because of America's inability to free itself from the sin and the myth of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. Such freedom begins, I believe, with what I call a moral memory. Moral memory is first and foremost about white America owning the truth of who they are. James Baldwin puts it this way. He says, "Go back to where you started. as far back as you can. Examine all of it. Travel your road again and tell the truth about it. Baldwin, in effect, calls white Americans to tell the truth about, as he puts it, the price of the ticket for being white in America. To do this is at least the beginning of white America taking responsibility for the past that it carries within it, and thus responsibility for the persistence of stand your ground culture. In this regard, moral memory is not about exonerating oneself from the past. Again, it is about taking responsibility for it. To have a moral memory is to recognize the past we carry within us, the past we want to carry within us, good and bad, and the past we need to make right. And writing the past is about more than facile apologies or even guilty verdicts for innocent black children, for killers of innocent black children. Rather, to write the past, to have a moral memory, is to recall the stories of America's chosen identity, the way it has been shaped by the Anglo-Saxon myth, and thus to recognize how it continues to play itself out in our current reality. A moral memory does not ignore, but recognizes the racial contract that I spoke of yesterday, that is America's democracy, and the way that contract continues to be enacted. A moral memory uncovers the relationship between the slavocracy and the industrial prison complex. It reveals the laws of stand your ground culture as reincarnations of the black codes. A moral memory allows one to see that what happened to Renisha, Jordan, Jonathan, and Trayvon are legalized 21st century lynchings. As President Obama said, invoking the words of William Faulkner in a speech that addressed America's racial history, the past is never dead, yet is not even past. A moral memory allows one to recognize how, in fact, the past is not past, but continues to shape present realities. Undoubtedly, it is only with the help of a moral memory that the connection between America's very sense of self and a stand your ground culture will come to light. Until that occurs, stand your ground culture will be an ever-present reality in our country. And so it is that Baldwin says this to white Americans. He says he wishes that white Americans would read for their own sakes this record and stop defending themselves against it. Only then, he says, will they be enabled to change their lives. The fact that they have not yet been able to do this, he says, to face their history, to change their lives, hideously menaces this country. Indeed, it menaces the entire world. To be sure, the justice of God, which is freedom from the sin of stand your ground culture, demands that America, especially white America, embraces a moral memory, which leads to a second requirement, if you will, of the justice of God, and that is a moral identity. A moral identity recognizes, as Paul Tillich says, that every human soul has infinite value. A moral identity is what Paul Tillich calls the courage to be oneself. To be oneself is to be the child of God that one is, nothing more and nothing less. A moral identity, therefore, is free from any constructs and ideologies that distort the integrity of another sacred being. A moral identity is one that is relieved from pretensions to superiority. It lets go of any myths that suggest one people is more valuable than another, or that one people is chosen by God while another is not. A moral identity affirms the sacred humanity of all human beings. Essentially, it is with moral identity that one lives into the image of a God who is free. For it frees one from moving through the world as if entitled because of blood and or color to certain wages such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the same time, it frees one to move through the world with empathy, thus feeling the suffering, the heartache, the hunger of others for life, liberty, and happiness. In many respects, a moral identity is the human response to Jesus' kenosis, that is, the way in which he emptied himself of anything that would set himself apart from humanity, especially crucified humanity. It is with a moral identity that one is able to enter into solidarity with the crucified class of one's own time. And thus, it is only with a moral identity that one is freed to recognize the face of Jesus and thus the very revelation of God in the black victims of stand your ground culture. And again, the justice of God depends upon it. The justice of God demands of us a moral identity. The justice of God also requires of us moral participation. Such participation is a matter of faith. We should be reminded that the Greek word for faith, as used in the Gospels, is pistis. I know we all remember that from our days here at Union. This word does not suggest a way of thinking about who God is or reflecting upon God's relationship to us. Rather, it points to a way of acting in light of our relationship to God. Put simply, faith is not about loyalty to a certain doctrine, dogma, or set of beliefs. Instead, it involves commitment to a certain way of living and moving and having our being in the world. As Gustavo Gutierrez says, faith is the total human response to God. And so it is that faith recognizes that God acts first, thus inviting human beings into a relationship. It is important to recognize that this invitation comes in the form of God acting in the world to make real the freedom of God, which is justice. Thus, God's call to faith is an invitation to become a partner with God in creating a world where justice is cherished and where freedom flourishes. In these stand your ground times, that means first and foremost, creating a world free from the violence of stand your ground culture. While the violence that sometimes disrupts protests, such as those in Ferguson and Baltimore, is readily named by dominant American culture, rarely named, if at all, because the violence that threatens the lives of black women and men and children every day in America, the violence bred by the sinful narrative of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. The caricatures ingrained within the American imagination of the threatening black male and angry black female, which lead to black people being twice as likely to be arrested and 4 times as likely to experience force during an encounter with police, those caricatures are violent. The criminal justice disparities that cause 1 in 15 black men to be incarcerated and make it 3 times more likely for black women in comparison to white women to be incarcerated are violent. A juvenile justice system in which black youth are disproportionately sentenced to adult prisons is violent. The socioeconomic policies rendering black children 4 times more likely than white or Asian children and significantly more likely than Latino children to live in poverty, those policies are violent. An educational system where black students are expelled at 3 times the rate of white students, and where a quarter of high schools with the highest percentage of black and Latino students do not offer any Algebra 2 classes, while a third of those schools do not have any chemistry classes. That educational system is violent. This is the unnamed violence that is woven into the fabric of America. It is the violence generated by the sin of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. It is the violence of stand your ground culture. And so, to strive for the justice of God requires the kind of moral participation that frees black and brown bodies from the complex systemic and structural violence of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism that devalues their very humanity every day. Justice, therefore, represents the peace of God. Again, this peace is a freedom from all that distorts the human person. No peace, no justice. And finally, The justice of God requires of us a moral imagination. A moral imagination is grounded in the absolute belief that the world can be better. It disrupts the notion that the world is as God has intended it to be. With a moral imagination, one is able to live proleptically. That is, as if the new heaven and the new earth were already here. In the words often attributed to Mahatma Gandhi, you must be the change you wish to see. This means one is not to be constrained by what is. Instead, with moral imagination, we are free to be oriented toward what will be. A moral imagination defies the power of stand-your-ground culture upon our lives. It recognizes this culture as a human construct that does not reflect God's justice. For the Black faithful, it is a moral imagination that gives hope. For such hope, trust, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., that the arc of God's universe does in fact bend toward justice. It was unquestionably a moral imagination that enabled King to proclaim that with or without him, Black people would get to the promised land. And it was within a moral imagination that King was able to close his I Have a Dream speech with the confidence that one day Black people would be free at last. And so, what does the justice of God in these stand-your-ground times look like, even as it requires of us moral memory, moral identity, moral participation, and a moral imagination? The justice of God looks like an end to the very culture which has virtually declared war on innocent young Black bodies, and nothing less than that. As shaken as I was by the senseless deaths of Trayvon, and then Jordan, and then Renisha, and then Jonathan, and then Michael, and then John, and then Demir, and I could go on, I have been even more moved by a mother's faith. These are mothers who refuse to be consoled until they get justice for their children. In her letter to Michael Brown's parents, Trayvon's mother, Sabrina Fulton, said, "We will bond as parents of slain children. We will continue," she said, "our fight for justice and make them remember our children in an appropriate light." We must all bond with these Black mothers. We must refuse to be consoled until this world is safe for our Black children, until God's justice is done, and thus stand-your-ground culture has not simply transformed itself, but has been absolutely defeated. 50 or so years ago, when King stood at the Lincoln Memorial, he said, "Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children." Now is the time. It is the time to live into God's time and to create the world we crave for our daughters and our sons, to create that new earth where the time of stand-your-ground culture is no more. Now is the time to be freed from the injustice of stand-your-ground culture. Now is the time for God's justice to be made real on earth as it is in heaven. Thank you.
So Dr. Douglas has agreed to have a conversation with us. We have a microphone, I believe. Is it in the back there? So if you could raise your hand, I'll just let Dr. Douglas field her own questions, and please get the microphone and make your questions very short so we have more time to hear these wise words.
Outstanding presentation. Arturo Schoenberg stated many years ago that it was the failure of oppressed victims in America to look at the experiences of other oppressed victims overseas. Just very quickly, if you could comment on the policies of this country, starting with the Kennedy administration, to have this exceptionalism towards countries of color.
I'm not quite sure. The last part of your question I didn't get.
The fact that the U.S. feels free to invade countries of color with this exceptionalism. For example, starting again with JFK and Cuba, going all the way to the present in the Middle East and Asia, Africa, and other countries in Latin America.
Yeah, well, that is indeed this notion. And when we look at this whole idea of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism, it also a part of this notion is the ideal of manifest destiny. Right? And so this whole ideal that we are destined to spread our culture because it is the culture sanctioned by God across the world. And manifest destiny, this whole notion of manifest destiny emerged in conjunction with war. And so it is a warring culture. It is an imperialistic culture. These are the privileges and wages of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. And so, of course, that means that particularly in relationship to persons of color across the world, that there is a disdain for those bodies, there is a disdain for the culture, because there is this sense of Anglo-Saxon superiority that has to save the world. Remember this whole, yesterday I spoke about this whole concept of the city on the hill, that is to be a beacon to the world of the city of God. And so you're right, it's part and parcel of this sense of ourselves, which is very warring and imperialistic and destructive of other peoples and nations, and we've seen that. It's one thing to empower a people to have the resources to live into the fullness of who they are. It's another thing to go to other countries to dismantle and disrupt the cultures of people, and in fact not to empower them but to disempower them so that you can make them into an image of yourself. So thank you.
Would you kindly speak to the matter of how Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and stand your ground culture applies to the local congregation, where it seems to be rare that you have dynamic congregations with substantial numbers of blacks and whites, and that you have the phenomenon of liberal white congregations that talk wonderfully well about equality and justice, and yet may have no black members.
And may not know black members?
May not have black members at all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, two things. Thank you for your question. First of all, of course, it's cliche that, but just because it's cliche doesn't mean it's not so, that one of the most segregated hours in America is the 11 o'clock hour. Now it's becoming the 10:30 hour on Sunday mornings. Well, the reason for that is because it's a reflection of the America that we are part of. People who experience the same life realities are people who worship together. Inasmuch as we live in a racialized country, again, as much as there's still a color line, and as much as stand your ground culture still reigns, the 11 o'clock or 10:30 hour will remain a segregated hour. It is a testament to the different life realities that black and white people experience. And so, in that regard, it is a manifestation of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and stand your ground culture. In terms of white church responses, first of all, and as I articulated, it's always very easy, isn't it, to sort of talk the good game. And it's safe to do so in these havens of church, and you can talk about it when nothing's on the line, and you can make these affirmations of faith without living in to the faith. I believe that within white congregations, there just has to be, as we say in Black church tradition, come to Jesus meetings. And I really mean that, white folk need to call each other out and really need to live into what I've tried to articulate, these things of moral responsibility, identity, etc., and name the way in which they live into the culture of whiteness. You see, to borrow from something, from a phrase of Jim Cone, Dr. Cone, in one of his books, just because you happen to look like a white American doesn't mean you have to act like one. And that's what James Baldwin says, to come to grips with the price of the ticket for being white America. He says this in his book, Price of the Ticket. He tries to look at the question. He says, what is the price of the ticket to be black in America? He says, before one can answer that question, we've got to answer the question of what is the price of the ticket to be white in America, right? And one of the price of the ticket of being white in America is that, white folks came from all over. Europeans came from all over, he says. They were Irish, they were whatever. But when they came here, they became white. And developed a white cultural hegemony and became white in opposition to everything that was non-white. White people need to go back and claim that, and claim what it meant to live and what it means to live into the privilege and sin of white culture. And you don't have to do that. And so the task for white Americans is to live over and against what it means to be white, and to not claim white culture. And once that happens, then they can begin to disengage and disrupt that culture. So I think, it's easy to be liberal in the abstract. And it doesn't mean that white people have to go out and find black people and be their friends. What white people have to do is find each other and decide that they're tired of being white. Then I'm very serious about that. And so that it is not, and I'll just add this, it is easy, isn't it? It's an easy thing to go out and befriend black people and to work for a moment in some black justice movement. What's harder is to go back to your community, to your church, and say, okay, now we have to claim our responsibilities, and to denounce being white in your own community. Let black folks take care of themselves, and white people need to begin to have those honest, deep conversations with themselves. Does that help? Thank you for your question. My friend's getting ready to be bad.
I hope not. I know you well, and I want to ask you to comment a bit more. I know you can't say everything in this talk, and so there's a few shortcuts. But I'm wondering about, first of all, what do you mean by black faith? And to me, it sounds like Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm wondering about is there's this Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism. We also have a Christian exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. And I'm also thinking about the idea of black faith and freedom, and the fact that in a lot of traditional black places, we're not talking about black liberation theology. We're talking about very traditional Christianity that rejects, for example, LGBTQ people, its own African spiritual origins that are definitely there, but we wouldn't claim that. Has a lot of issues still with women and gender. Mm-hmm. And just to think about that as well, because it isn't all about freedom. I mean, not for everybody. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, if you could comment on that a bit. And
yes, very good. And I'm glad you asked the question. In fact, I expand on that a great deal in the writings from which I took this talk and in other places. Black church can't have it both ways. If indeed at the center of in this instance, and I'll talk about beyond Christianity in a minute, if at the center of the black faith tradition, black Christian tradition, and it is at the center, is this Exodus paradigm, this belief in the God that is liberator, this belief in the God that is free, then that which it claims and that which it affirms is also that which it has to be critiqued by, right? And so the black church has to live into its own belief in the God that is free and be critiqued by that. So at any point in time, when the black church indeed finds itself, as it does in relationship to women, LGBTQ people, and we could go on, finds itself excluding, suppressing, oppressing, all the things that it does, it then has betrayed the meaning of what it means to be Christian, and I'm sorry, it has also betrayed its own blackness, right? And so one of the things that we have to also remember, and I say this, that when we talk about the Exodus tradition, we got to tell the whole story. And so we have to tell the story that, and this was, the Israelites weren't chosen because, in my estimation, they weren't chosen because they were exceptional and they were such great people. They were chosen because God looked down and saw that they were enslaved. And God chose freedom, right? And so what it meant to be chosen was to live into this narrative of freedom. In the moment that they stopped doing that, right, the moment that they began to oppress their own and oppress others, the prophets came and prophesied not against the Canaanites, but prophesied against whom? The Israelites, because they no longer lived into what it meant to be chosen by God, to be free and a free people. And to be a free people is to be free from all that which would oppress others. And so that same narrative must apply to black church people, right? And of course, the Exodus narrative also becomes problematic because these people also went into Canaan land, and there were all these other people of another. This is manifest destiny writ large of another culture that they wiped out because they were supposed to spread, they believed, themselves and their nation. That's problematic, and I don't know what to do with that part of the narrative except to say that there are troubling parts of the narrative that don't coincide with whom we claim God to be, and those parts of the narrative can't have authority for us. And so one of the things that must consistently be lifted up in the black faith tradition is the prophetic tradition that critiques that kind of injustice and that kind of exclusivity and that kind of imperialism. In regard to that, clearly I speak from out of a black faith tradition that is Christian. But even as I do that, it recognizes the imperialistic tendencies or the imperialistic opportunities of Christianity, because here's the problem. It's a problem with all religions. Religions can turn evil, can't they? And one of the reasons that it is so easy for Christianity to do that is because Christianity happens to be the religion of those in power. When you mix religion with power, watch out. All right? And so that's why some of us believe that the worst thing that ever happened to Christianity was Constantine. And Christianity became the religion of the state. But in as much as that happens, it's antithetical to a religion in which its quote unquote savior died on the cross. And so in my estimation, that when we talk about Christianity being used in a manner that oppresses anybody, right, then it is no longer Christian. It has betrayed its very center, the God who revealed God's self on the cross. And so far as I'm concerned, at any time that Christianity is used to oppress black people, LGBTQ people, people of other religious traditions, well, I'm quite clear, then it's of the Antichrist and it's not Christian. And so you're right, there's that ongoing critique. Just because people happen to, being a black American does not exonerate one from living into a white narrative. We have examples of that in the political world. Oops, did I say that?
So that is part of my question. In your account of Stand Your Ground and Anglo-Saxon entitlement, supremacy, all of that, and the role that plays in white churches, I was shocked to hear from my own staff gathered this Monday morning after the massacre at Mother Emanuel, to hear how few white liberal churches in New York talked about it. It was shocking, and yet not shocking. Mm-hmm. And I think a dimension of the white supremacy is not only how violent it makes the white supremacist system, but how stupid it makes that system. And you can see in our present political system where you have poor white people who have absolutely nothing to gain from an alignment with extreme white supremacist wealth, aligning themselves with that. So could you talk a little bit about how this stupidity plays itself out, the delusional quality of this?
Yeah. No, thanks, Dr. Jones, and very good question. One of the privileges, one of the wages of whiteness is the wage or the privilege to be ignorant and to not know, right? And so what do they lose not knowing? And it is the privilege, yes, to not know. What's missing, therefore, is this sense of, while we're on the morals, moral recognition. And living in the culture of whiteness and steeped into what all of that means, and without having some sense of disconnect from that, I think deprives one, blinds one, prevents one from having the kind of moral recognition that allows you to see when things are simply not the way they're supposed to be, right? And so that's a wage of whiteness. In terms of, let's see, the second part of your question, oh, yes. There's a history. That's about the significance of whiteness. And we talked about it a little bit yesterday when we talked about white immigrants that initially came into the country, and the Anglo-Saxon narrative and the stewards of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism were clear that these new white immigrants, the new stock as they were called, weren't the old stock. These new stock weren't Anglo-Saxons. They didn't come from the right place of Europe. But here's the thing they had, and here's the thing they used. They said, well, at least we're white, right? This is the power of whiteness. They can say, at least we aren't black. So much so that we know that they changed the certain language systems and how they refer to themselves. For instance, that oftentimes servants were white, right? And so, but instead of wanting to be called servants, they called themselves, they call themselves the help. And that's where the help comes from, because they said if you're a servant, then you have a master. Couldn't have that. Only black people could be servants. Forget that these were white people that were servants. They said no, they wanted to consistently make the distinction between themselves and black people. It's also where the word boss came from, because as James Fenimore Cooper says in one of his writings, he says that once someone traveled and they knocked on the door and the white servant opened the door and the person said, "Where is your master?" They said, "Oh, no. White people can't have masters." So they used the word boss, right? Which is a Dutch word that means master. But, so that what they clung on to was the fact that at least they were white. And so again, what it does is it masks one's real self-interest, because they believe that their real self-interest is found in their ability to be white. And in fact, the stewards of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism said this, like Theodore Roosevelt was one who said that they can, because of their whiteness, they can become adopted Anglo-Saxons. Black people can't be that. You know, you can look at a white person and not know whether they're Anglo-Saxon or not, really, in terms of their heritage, as long as they live into Anglo-Saxon ways. You can look at a black person and know that they aren't Anglo-Saxon. And so whiteness becomes, that's the ideology of white supremacy. And so they become invested and cling on to that by any means necessary. And that means living in opposition, even when it's against their real self-interest, living in opposition to black people. I mean, black people experience this every day in what we call microaggressions. And I don't know why we call them microaggressions, because they don't feel so micro. But you experience every day, you know, you go into a store, and, you know, white people are waiting on you. But they treat you with such disdain. And you think to yourself, they're waiting on me. I mean, they're, you know, the clerk. But what they're saying is, at least I'm better than you because at least I'm white. And so that's what Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism does. That's what cherished white property is all about. That's whiteness always living in opposition to that which is non-white. And for those who are the least of these in the white world, right, at least they can feel good about themselves because they're what? They're white. And so that's what you see, and it's a false narrative, isn't it? And they don't realize that they're really going against their own self-interest. We see that in the politic today.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It has spoken to me on many different levels. And I think what it's speaking to most right now is like, I'm tired, but not weary. And so what's really, I'd like if you could expand on this concept of moral imagination and the power and responsibility of disrupting the notion that the world is how it should be.
Yeah. I don't know, and I don't, and how an oppressed people move through the world and keep putting one foot in front of the other every day without the hope of a moral imagination. If you accept that this is just the way it's going to be, then that is tiring. It's more than tiring, it just wears you down. I don't know, I think oftentimes of the enslaved. And who I think of are those who were born into slavery and died in slavery. People who didn't know at all another way of living. How did they do it? And they have given witness to how they did it through the faith tradition that has emerged from there, that they believed that there was would be a better and different world. They truly lived in to this notion that they were not meant to be slaves and that the world in which they were part of wasn't going to be the world in which they believed would die. And so it's the hope. And to me, without it, you end up in despair. And so to me, that's why it is Martin Luther King saying, look, you know, the arc of the universe bends toward justice, so keep living into that arc, all right? That doesn't mean there aren't times that you grow despairing, but you just have to live into that hope. And I know one of the conversations that my book has entered into through other people has been a conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. And of course, he and I have sort of paint the same landscape. And it is a despairing landscape, right? But one of the differences is the hope. And his lack of hope has him saying, I'm going to leave the country, right? Because there is no way for America to change. If I were simply relying on America to change itself, well, probably leave the country. And then where would you go? Because America's like, where do you go? And so I don't want to end up on Mars, so where do you go? But one, of course, for me, relies, of course, on the transcendent power of God. And even for those that don't believe in God, one can believe in the reality of the universe, and that the universe, the energy of the universe, bends toward justice, and that it will correct itself. I have a colleague who says that when we go too far, the universe corrects itself. And that's ecologically and otherwise. Sometimes those corrections are cataclysmic, but you can't go so far in one direction without it. It's sort of like the Wall Street, the economy. What do they always say? Oh, it's got to correct itself. Well, the hope even for those who would not talk about a transcendent being is the hope in a universe that does bend toward justice and that it will correct itself. And so I don't know how you do it. I don't, without that kind of hope.
Seems to me we need a prophetic voice of John the Baptist calling for repentance of our sin of racial discrimination, to release our humanity and dignity of all people and change the heart of America.
I agree, and repentance means turning around and going in a different direction. And so repentance, again, so I agree with you. So repentance means, again, all that we've discussed today, that people have to renounce what it means to live into this culture of Anglo-Saxon exceptionalism and renounce this ideology of whiteness. And so I agree. Repentance would mean America changing its course. Thank you. Thank you.